Our first speaker is in New York, so I'm just going to introduce him while Ben is getting him online. So, his name, Professor Scott Atran is an anthropologist at the University of Michigan. He's the research director in anthropology at the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, in France. He's also a professor of psychology and public policy at the University of Michigan. Can we mute him as well?
Yeah, sure.
I'll just take it down.
And he holds a number of positions at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Oxford University, and other research institutions around the world. So he's an expert in social and political conflict, anthropology, and religion and culture, essentially. And what we're interested to hear from him today, in particular, his latest book is called Talking to the Enemy, Violent Extremism, Sacred Values and What It Means to Be Human. And in that book he did a lot of field research into spending a lot of time with people involved in extremist activities in Indonesia, people connected to the Madrid bombings in Europe, in Afghanistan, and also in Gaza as well. And his conclusions are interesting. So he's going to talk more about that when we have him online. So if we could perhaps start, I'm not sure how you wanted to start, Scott, but we were thinking perhaps if you could start by talking about your field research and what you found about how people become attracted to and how what sort of processes go on in terms of people getting involved in extremism and becoming radicalized.
All right. I was a French scientific sort of attaché to Jerusalem during the first Intifada, and I both taught at the Hebrew University and Bir Zayt during the first Intifada, and I worked with the Hamas as it just was forming. They provided me and the Muslim Brotherhood students to track sort of disappeared Palestinian villages. So that was my experience with that group. And then, I worked with the Mayan Indians for many years. And then 9/11 happened. And I saw the reaction to it and people confounding Hamas and Al-Qaeda. And I decided to look much more deeply into why people were reacting that way and what any connections, if there were, between such groups. And I found very little, to tell you the truth. I wrote an article for Science magazine in 2003 called Genesis of Suicide Terrorism, and that provoked a pretty wide international reaction. And then I decided to go to the field and work with different groups, that is, Mujahideen, whether they were in Pakistan or among the Jamaat Islamiyah in India. I've spent much time with the Hamas, including with Politburo leaders, all of them, and with the families and friends of the 9/11 bombers, pilot bombers, the Madrid bombers, and working also with homegrown domestic terrorism in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And a number of things I found. For example, that first in the first wave of Al-Qaeda, for example, most were fairly well educated, mostly middle class, mostly or upper middle class, married. The plurality were engineers or doctors, and you find in all successful revolutionary and insurgent groups that most people who lead those groups are doctors and engineers, because those are the groups, those are the people that can show commitment and delay gratification. And I found also in general, as a sort of ancillary field of research, that insurgent groups since 1950 have on the average been successful against groups of governments and groups that are up to 10 times more powerful in terms of material and manpower, because regular forces are motivated by standard cost-benefit rewards and punishments, including pay and career status, whereas insurgents and revolutionary groups are motivated by commitment and sacrifice. And of course, nothing compares to the sacrifice of the totality of self-interest, for example, in suicide bombing.
So, Scott,
there were great differences.
Can I just to clarify that point? Essentially, violent extremists need to be treated like insurgent or revolutionary groups.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think for jihadis, yes, so. Less so for domestic white supremacists in the United States. I can tell you why. I find that there are huge differences between groups. Again, generally, political groups are arrayed around a spectrum from commitment to absolute values that motivate them, that motivate their political program or religious program, to social responsibilities. They have to provide security and economic welfare for their people. And you find groups like Al-Qaeda on one end, where they're willing in the end to sacrifice anything and anybody to immediately realize goals, versus a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, which has goals and has values, some of which are in strong conflict with, say West.
Sorry,
say West.
Professor Scott, can I just forgot to mention before that we have an interpreter for a couple of our audience members. So if I could just ask you to perhaps slow it down a little bit, just so he has time. He's simultaneously interpreting, but we just need a bit more time to kind of process. But please continue.
All right, I'll slow down.
Thanks.
So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, which have very strong values, but also have a responsibility to their people and try to meet those responsibilities. And in doing so, they are willing to delay or perhaps eventually even change their values. And then we have groups like the Taliban or Hamas, which are really not interested in anyone's homeland but their own. They're not really part of global jihad in any sense. Certainly the Afghan Taliban aren't, but are interested much more in nationalist agenda, however radical or not it may be. There's been a bombing here in Boston a couple of days ago.
Yeah, we've been following that.
And there's been a huge media reaction to this. The New York Times has asked for my reaction, and if you want, I can go through that reaction.
Perhaps, yeah, the main points of it, because what we wanted actually, aside from a general overview, because we're in the West, we're in Australia here, we're particularly interested in what happens in the Western context. But please go through that, and maybe if there's anything pertinent to that as well, we'll follow.
Okay, well, the Boston bombings have provoked the most intense display of law enforcement and media coverage since 9/11. Greater Boston is in full lockdown. Cable news here describes it as a ghost town, a city in terror, a war zone. Public transportation is stopped. No zone is proclaimed. People are told to stay indoors. Schools and universities are closed. Hundreds of FBI agents are pulled from pressing investigations to exclusively focus on this case, along with tens of thousands of federal, state, and city agents equipped with heavy weapons and armored vehicles. All of this is mobilized to track down just 2 young people with low-tech explosives and small arms. There has been, just an hour or so ago, U.S. authorities have issued a global security alert through Interpol for 190 countries. And my feeling is this, is as with the overall U.S. reaction to terrorism since 9/11, perhaps never before in history have so few people armed with so few actual means caused so much fear among so many people. And the question for me is sort of why? Why this hysteria? Why has it taken hold of our political establishment and media to the extent it has? And we know that, very little information is available about the brothers Tsarnaev, who were two Chechen brothers, immigrants that came in as U.S. asylum seekers under the government's refugee resettlement program, which, by the way, was explicitly designed to prevent radicalization. But the two brothers and how they radicalize along the pathway to violence seems to be really no different than any of the other jihadi plots against the West that I've come up against, whether it be the Madrid pilot bombers or these homegrown terrorists in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in Australia, for that matter. I've been working a lot with the Defense Department, and we have a multinational team. I'm getting an echo here.
Sorry, I just, yes, go on.
And our finding indicates that terrorist plotters against Western civilian populations tend to be not to be parts of sophisticated foreign-based command and control organizations, but belong to loose homegrown networks of families and friends from neighborhoods, chat rooms, soccer teams, that die not for a cause so much as for each other. They pretty much span the normal distribution of the population. There are very few psychopaths or sociopaths or very brilliant strategists and thinkers, although there are a few at either end. And wannabe jihadis today are mostly young people. Unlike the original Al-Qaeda group, which was basically well-motivated, well-educated, they tend to be more and more marginalized. Young guys in transitional stages of their lives, students, immigrants in search of jobs, between girlfriends, looking for companions. And this movement promises a sort of meaningful cause, camaraderie, adventure, and glory. Most have a secular education, and they become born again into the jihadi cause in their late teens and 20s. Few, if any, ever go to madrasas. I'm not counting the Taliban, or very few, about 10 or so of the 30,000 madrasas in Indonesia that happen to be involved with this. And, occasionally they'll hook up with a fellow traveler who has had some connection to someone who's been up in Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they may give them, a few days or even a couple of weeks of training, but that's increasingly rare. Most are caught anyway. But it's the internet and social media that are usually sufficient for radicalization and even operational preparation. I can go on.
So, what would you say, is there a connection, do you think, between ideas or ideology and likelihood of becoming radicalized, or is that sort of incidental, do you think?
No, it's not incidental. The greatest exertions by human beings, even greater than for family or friends, is for transcendental ideas. The very notion of Islam or submission is submission of family and tribal and kin ties to the larger community. This Thomas Hobbes called the privilege of absurdity, to which no creature but man is subject. Darwin took this as moral virtue, which generates patriotism, fidelity, and loyalty, which allows some groups to win out over other groups in the spiraling competition for dominance in the world. And those ideas that are most powerful are sacred values. Sacred values are values that defy cost-benefit logic, risks and rewards, that motivate actions independently of likely or rationally expected outcomes. Such values tend to be immune from trade-offs. People will not sell their child, for example, for all the money in China or their country or their religious ideas. They tend to be immune to temporal discounting. So events in the past or the future which are associated with these sacred ideas are considered even more pressing and important than ideas of the recent past or the future. They block people to exit strategies, so other people can't buy them off, even if there's a rationally better deal down the line. And that's why groups based on transcendental ideals, sacred values, survive over groups based strictly on social contracts. And this isn't just the great religions. This is groups like, for example, the American Revolutionaries. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But if you look at the last 200,000 years of human history, it's been defined mostly by cannibalism, infanticide, suppression of minorities and women, and then a bunch of intellectuals 250 years ago decided that everybody should be equal. And the American Revolutionaries said, we're willing, and by the way, they had the highest standard of living in the world in 1776. They said, we're willing to sacrifice our lives and fortunes and our sacred honor for this crackpot idea. And they won. Mohammed's idea was very similar. It united a bunch of fragmented tribes, marginal to world movements and world power, and created an incredibly powerful force that conceptually and economically united people all the way from the Atlantic to almost the Pacific. So again, these values are very important. Now, these values can be for the good or for the bad. They're the things that have motivated human rights and civil rights and universal religions, but they're also things that have motivated terrible things. A good example, for example, is the Nazi doctrine. Never before, for example, have people fought so bravely for a cause so bad. German military units, for example, were able to suffer much greater casualties than American Soviet military units because the young people were bound together and convinced of their idea. Hitler, for example, had these crackpot racial ideas. The Jews of Vienna, for example, petitioned the Reich, offering them billions of dollars worth of Deutschmarks if they would not be classified as Jewish. Hitler had his racial, and by the way, in 1938, the Reich needed all the money they could get. They were planning a war, and on paper they had a much weaker military than the French, and they rejected all but 6 out of 12,000 applications because the guy truly believed in his absurdity. Now, the jihadis will lock themselves into a similar situation. Mostly it's through friends and family and fellow travelers. And they basically, what happens is they join the larger protest movement against what they perceive as the persecution of Islam. And then they usually denounce their fellows as being too timid, not willing to act. And this is at the point they're usually expelled from the mosque. Almost all of them are expelled from the mosque. There's very little plotting ever done in any mosque. You have to be quiet and pray in a mosque. And even in the sessions, the Friday sessions, there's a range of opinion tolerated. But these people become increasingly intolerant. The imam usually expels them. It certainly happened with the Salafi Imam Monir in the M30 mosque in Madrid. And then they go off into a parallel universe. They usually get an apartment together. This is what the 9/11 bombers did in Hamburg, the Madrid bombers did, the Bali bombers did. They get a place, they live together, they psych themselves up, they watch videos of persecutions and killings in Bosnia, or Chechnya, or Palestine, or Afghanistan, or wherever. They come out of their cocoon wanting to do something, but often they don't even know what to do. Like the guys who eventually wound up attacking the United States in 9/11, first they wanted to go to Chechnya. They went to a travel agent. The travel agent said, look, the Russians aren't going to let you in. Then they wanted to go to Bosnia, and the Bosnian said, have you had any experience fighting? And they said no. They said, well, get us Russian night goggles, which were just coming onto the market after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that wasn't glorious enough for them. So they met somebody on a train who said, look, I'll get you to Pakistan. Maybe you can find a way up to Chechnya. They wound up in Kandahar, where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who had just put in his bid, his project. I mean, Al-Qaeda is not a recruiting agency. Al-Qaeda simply funds mostly self-seekers, like the National Science Foundation or whatever the research foundation is in Australia. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's proposal had been accepted, with a divided vote, by the way. And basically he said, hey boss, look what fell into my lap, guys who could get visas to go to the United States. The Bali bombers, they were not funded by Al-Qaeda, although there were some contacts. They were mostly self-organized and not very well organized. I mean, as they're about to take the bombs to the nightclubs to blow up the people in Bali, they realize that the guys who the young kids who they got as suicide bombers couldn't drive a car, so they had to give them driving lessons. The Madrid bombers, just as they're about to, they financed the whole thing through drug money because the Western powers have been so successful at cutting off funds, major funds, charities to jihadi sympathizers. The jihadis have to go to criminal groups because that's where the clandestine funds are. Now here's the interesting thing. Economic theory tells you that people become petty criminals because of opportunity costs. They're at the margins of society, they can't get regular jobs, they choose a life of crime because the payoff is worthwhile to them. But what we're finding, as with Madrid, is that the petty criminals are the ones actually blowing themselves up. And the reason is they just don't want to be petty criminals. And now they've got a chance, rather than to be marginal, to be meaningful. And so we find something interesting happening. The trajectory, the trend in participants in jihad has been slowly changing from well-educated, middle and upper class, committed idealists to much more marginalized, less educated, transitional youth looking for glory in a cause, looking to emulate sort of the heroes of the Soviet-Afghan War or of 9/11.
So there's a myth that they buy into. Would that be a point of intervention, perhaps, if you're working at a community level? I mean, where would that be?
All right. So, look, you lock into these values. Now, the path to political radicalization can be long or short, but it's a path. It's a process. A lot of people are sympathetic to jihadi values. A lot. I mean, about 7% of Muslims, according to Pew and Gallup polls, are strongly sympathetic to the 9/11 attacks. About 13% sympathize or at least understand them. That's a small minority, but out of 1.4 billion Muslims, that's 100 to 200 million people. Yet out of that 100 to 200 million people, okay, who have some sympathy with these values, very, very few go to violence. In the United States, you've had 500 to 600 arrested, mostly in law enforcement sting operations. That means that instead of taking them out of the pathway to violence, they encourage them to the pathway to violence. They could very well have gone away from it. In Europe, you've got about 4,000 to 5,000 people I've arrested out of millions of more Muslims, but of those Muslims, we find that very, very few have had religious education. In fact, religious education is a negative predictor of involvement in jihad. So the question of specificity is, given these values, what locks them into it so that there's no going back and they're willing to commit violence? And the answer seems to be whether or not they belong to action-oriented groups. Soccer teams, whitewater rafting, even pinball, clubs. So we find, for example, Bin Laden himself had a soccer team. 52 people from neighborhood in Darna in Libya went to Iraq to blow themselves up. Places where I work with in northern Morocco, the Jama Mezouak, 5 of the 7 kids, they blew themselves up after cornered by the Spanish police after the Madrid bombings. They grew up in the same neighborhood in the Jama Mezouak in Tetuan. In the Hamas, even the suicide bombing campaign the biggest suicide bombing campaign from December 2003 to January 2003 was carried out by 10 kids from the same soccer team. It can't be that they're all psychopaths, right? They're socialized with their buddies, and they're self-socialized, and they're mostly self-seeking. Again, they're young people in search of glory. And here's an interesting anecdote. So I'm in the Jama Mezouak after the Madrid bombing, and I've just talked to the families, and I found out that some other relatives of the guys who blew themselves up in Madrid 5 others and their friends went off to Iraq to blow themselves up in Bakuba and elsewhere. And so I'm asking the kids who are playing in the garden. This is a poor neighborhood, fairly religious, but not overwhelmingly so. They're playing soccer in the garbage. And I'm asking them, who's your hero? And they say, number 1 hero is Ronaldinho. By the way, most of the young world is divided between the Barca soccer club and the Madrid soccer club. Number 2 hero was the Terminator. They had no idea he was related to the then governor of California. And number 3 hero was Osama bin Laden. I went back a week after Barack Obama was elected president of the United States. I asked the same question to the kids, different kids, but the same neighborhood, also playing soccer in the same place. 8 to 15 years old. Number 1 hero, Eto'o, the Cameroonian striker from the Barca team, tied with Sergio Morales from the Real Madrid team. Number 2 is Terminator 2. He had finally made it to the neighborhood. Number 3, just beating out Osama bin Laden, was Barack Obama. So what's that telling us? Telling us that these kids are in a fork in their life, looking for heroes and role models and something to be. And then they have different messages. One says, yes, you can. The other says, happiness is martyrdom. You can change the world just like 4 guys with box cutters did. They can shake the mightiest power on earth and change history. Now, you can do this too. And so they're looking at the world, at the heroes, at the models before them, and choosing. And so the intervention has to be at the level of young people, at the level of their networks, at the level of heroes, at the level of adventure. I'm at the White House, reporting to the National Security Council, talking to them about these networks. And a young woman from Dick Cheney's staff says to the council, this is at the White House, don't these young people understand that if they behave this way, we're going to have to kill them, we're going to bomb them? Sort of was taken aback, and I asked her to repeat that, and I said, what, are you kidding? You're going to bomb London? You're going to bomb Morocco? I mean, you got to come with something else. So the next time I went to the White House, I brought comic books with me. One of the comic books I brought with me was The 99. And this is a comic book that's now going to be a motion picture, a syndicated TV show by a Kuwaiti political scientist who got his degree from Columbia University but works out of Kuwait. And the 99 are the 99 faces of Allah, each represented by a sort of gemstone. And young people around the world, from different backgrounds, rich to poor, are action heroes. Some of them don't know that they have a privileged way of finding one of these gemstones, but sort of by accident, through adventure, they do. And then when 2 of them link up, their power for good increases. That is for UNICEF or UNESCO or whatever, and against the jihad. And the more of them who that link up, sometimes by purpose, sometimes spontaneously, the more they realize God's mission for good in the world. Well, okay, that may be as kitsch but surely as catchy as the jihadi cool, which motivates a lot of young people.
So it's really about providing an alternative narrative. I mean, I guess something that the people are kind of falling out of, if you like, the narrative that's being presented by whoever's providing a narrative about Islam in their communities is just not playing. Like they're not interested in that. Is that right?
Yeah, for some, there is this, first of all, there's this crazy notion of a clash of civilizations, where, there's, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these sort of atavistic millennial traditions were resurgent. When I think it's more a clash a collapse of cultures, of traditional cultures, where the traditional lines of communication between elders and youngers, between fathers and sons, between mothers and daughters is collapsing, crashing. And young people are looking, instead of vertically, traditionally through their cultures, they're looking horizontally over the internet and across the world to link up with fairly superficial but powerful messages that meet the conditions of this massive media-driven connection and political awakening that now unites the world. And it unites people, for example, from Borneo or Sulawesi, who have been separated by, I believe in evolution, who are separated by 55,000 years of human evolution from people, say, in Chechnya and Palestine, but yet are willing to go to Chechnya and Palestine. It can't be because they share a history. It has to be because they share a narrative. And that narrative is made possible by this massive media-driven awakening that's happened for the first time in human history. So they're connecting vertically to a rather superficial message, but a powerful one. Muslims are being persecuted. It works to the extent that the message and the messenger can convince people that their personal frustrations and aspirations resonate with their sense of global injustice. So it's very hard for this to be the case in the United States among most Muslims. For example, in the United States, Muslim immigrants, usually in the first generation, achieve the mean or surpass the mean in terms of educational status and economic income within the first generation. In Europe, and I don't know how it is in Australia, but it's probably similar, in Europe, even in the third generation, in Spain, for example, they're 19 times more likely to be poor. In France, 70% of prison inmates are Muslim. They're only 8% of the population. You have these huge ghettos. In England, it's 5 to 7 times more likely to be poor. So the social tissue, which is built for immigration in the United States, usually prevents the embedding of jihadist aspirations and frustrations, while in Europe, of course, it does not.
The actual social backgrounds, we're talking in the Western context, if you like, it's not just the narrative, but it's also whether people feel like they're actually unequal, on a level playing field, if you like, with other members of society. Is that?
Yes, of course. As I say, you go to New York, for example. It's the only place in the world I know where Palestinians and Israelis actually get along. Sort of anybody can find a place in New York. And you go to Europe, and you find, here I go to the post office. I'll just give you an example. I live in France as well. So I'm at the post office, and, an elderly gentleman and his wife go to get some forms to establish a postal account. And the postal clerk starts yelling at them and treating them like they're morons. They're idiots, okay? Their French isn't perfect. They're a little halting. They're a little old. Okay, the young children who are with them are watching this, and they are brought up in a tradition of respect for their parents, and they see them being treated terribly, and they're very resentful. I'll give you another example. So I'm interviewing a young man in a prison in France who wants to blow up the American embassy. He's arrested for blowing up the American embassy. So I said, why did you want to do that? So he goes into the whole litany of problems in Bosnia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, all this. I said, yes. I've heard this before. But why you? And he said, well, okay, I'm walking along the street, Boulevard de la République in Paris one day with my sister, and she wears a hijab. And there's the whole debate about hijab. French people are very sensitized to that. And she's window shopping, and she's not looking where she's going, and she bumps into this sort of middle-aged gentleman walking along the street. And the gentleman turns to her and says to her with a sneer, Salah Arab, dirty Arab. And her brother says, well, then I was convinced that there was really no hope here in the West, and I decided to join the jihad. So I said, yeah, but persecution and repression and racial discrimination, this has been a commonplace for decades, if not centuries. Why now? He says, because until now the jihad didn't exist. So it's an attractor out there. There's no real recruiters, but it is, especially since the demise of the sort of Al-Qaeda core, it's a social movement that has certain attractors. It could be internet imams, it could be speeches of bin Laden, it could be some Daesh it's, temporary preachers who come through. It could be almost anything. And they give expression to these frustrations and aspirations, and at the same time search for meaning and glory that happens to motivate young men. And that is, I think, the role of the jihad. Again, it's not a command and control organization as much as a center of attraction, of conceptual attraction for such people, such young people.
Right. So before I kind of open up to some more questions, so just to kind of summarize, then there's kind of three factors at play here. There's a breakdown of these traditional structures of respect and of traditional narratives, and their replacement by these narratives presented by like Al-Qaeda and other, if you like, ideologues, as well as if you like, the social conditions for each and every individual, and their the reasons why they in particular might, if you like, become radicalized or become so angered or humiliated, if you like, and that's the second part of the narrative as well. There's a narrative of Muslim humiliation. So those kind of three things all working together. Would that be okay?
Yes, but remember, humiliation in not the sense that most people think. So we've actually done studies where we show that people who feel humiliated themselves tend to be passive and not to undertake any kinds of activism or action. But people who vicariously feel that others who they care for are humiliated, they, on the other hand, tend to take action. And then there's a third factor which is extremely important. And that is that publicity is the oxygen of terrorism. I mean, if you actually think about it, the actual number of terrorist attacks and the significance of terrorist attacks, especially against the West, are minuscule, are vanishingly small. Most of them are fail, and those that succeed produce less and are produced certainly in traffic accidents in a day, or even lawnmower accidents in a year. The chances of actually being killed in one of these things is about 10 million to 1. And yet it has mobilized the resources of society. It's changed the civil character of society. It's changed the security apparatus of society. It has this spectacle, and terrorism feeds off this theater and spectacle of these acts, is amplified by the media, which also is no longer a social good, interested in public service, but on the sensation of which violence is a privileged stimulant.
Yes, and that notoriety feeds actually makes it more attractive, if you like, to people considering this kind of thing.
Yes, I mean it's an unplanned but tacit alliance between the media and terrorism, and of course that impacts politicians, because politicians must be responsive to the media even more than the public, and so they're in a tacit alliance with this thing, and the whole thing is so outsized and disproportionate. Although, for example, a terrorist attack could really never threaten the economic, social, or political infrastructure of the United States or the European Union or Australia, the reaction to it can, and already is starting to. And I think we have to be as worried or more worried concerning the reaction to terrorism than terrorist attacks themselves.
Okay, we have a question from the audience.
Thank you so much for this most enlightening discourse about the factors that may lead to violent radicalization. And shukran. You're speaking to a group of imams and community leaders in Australia, a Western context. And whilst I totally understand the various factors that may lead to violent radicalization, among which that you have mentioned, there are the international factors which really don't relate too much to us, but the contextual factors such as marginalization, racism, unemployment, and so on. And these are things that, as a group of imams, we have no control over. This is a societal problem, this is a government problem, we have no control over. However, there is one pertinent point that you've raised, and I think that relates to all of us here, and that is often those young men or those youth who end up on the radicalization or violent radicalization course were initially at the mosques, then they found themselves unwanted, they left the mosques, made up groups or social groups around a network that identifies with their own ideas, and then from there people become radicalized. The question therefore for us as imams, how can we intervene? What do we do that is within our capacity to stop that process of radicalization before they leave the mosque? Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Again, I think it's a pathway to violence. Sometimes it's long, sometimes it's relatively rapid. You have to intervene after they leave the mosque, for example, or when they look like they're about to leave the mosque, at the level of families and friends, trying to talk to their families and friends, but also offer them not moderation. Young people are not interested in moderation. Those of you, especially those here in the West who have teenagers and young adults who are children, anytime you try to teach them moderation, they'll do the opposite. You can't tell them what their girlfriend should be, their boyfriend should be, what styles they should take on, and what ideas they should have. So one thing is to look for what can mobilize their energy, their action, their need for adventure and glory within the framework of Islam that is not in the direction of violence. And that's a challenge, I think, for everyone. It's not something that, now, this is for people who go to the mosque and who have a religious sentiment to begin with. For those who don't, the question here for Western social policy is how to prevent people from sort of being born again into a radical mindset. And again, it's trying to deal with within their networks, proposing to them ideas and courses of actions which are both feasible and adventurous. And I don't find any of this happening. Let me just give you another example. So I'm asked by USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, which is an arm of the State Department, which provides social services to, in a sense, promote the values of the United States, or at least its economic interests. It's hard to tell which. And so I'm in Morocco, and they have this huge local governance program. First thing I can say about it, it's like many of these local programs, absolutely corrupt, because it funnels money through cronies of the current political establishment. Could be the king's mother-in-law, brother, family, or those in power. Usually they rent out offices at 3 times the rates of most offices. Most of their money is spent on self-feeding. Those that get the money, to give the money to USAID, the contractors, about 80% of it rests in the United States as overhead, and the rest goes to cronyism, and very little gets to the people. Sometimes there really are good programs, but they're usually small programs like women getting orphaned women or abandoned women off the streets. They are the result of very little money and committed men and women who do this, but it's the minority. In any event, the United States has these huge, massive, billion-dollar programs for local governance and aid in the Maghreb, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. So I'm evaluating how successful they are, right? So they give me a list of 30 indicators to evaluate that they concoct up in Washington. And I say, so these are your evaluation metrics. And they say, yeah. Well, I say, okay, let's take the first one here. First one is how many Dar al-Shabab, how many youth houses have been built with American funds through local government's initiatives. I said, this is a real metric. I said, don't you care what goes on in the youth houses? So I started visiting the youth houses. And in the youth houses, kids are surfing the internet where there are computers, often jihadi sites, and they've invented this ersatz language, Franglish, which is Spanish, English, French, and Arabic, sort of all rolled into one. Many of them are semi-literate. They're communicating about girls, about jobs, about jihad, about action figures, about movies, about food, about everything you can think of. About computers. And it's fascinating because it's something they invented themselves and something they're passionate about. So I asked the people in charge of the program, so what's your reaction to this? And they said, well, we've got to stop this. I said, you got to be kidding. It's the only thing they've invented themselves. Rather than kill it, you should develop it. You should help them. You should try to funnel ideas and programs through something that they themselves have invented and are passionate about. And I think this is a general lesson. And I do not see any government programs dealing with the reality of young people in their own networks with their own passions and their own needs. Right. And I think through the mosques, this can be done even more fruitfully.
But the essential kind of factor there is programs that actually are, if you like, bottom up.
Yes.
That really tap into what people are interested in, whether it's perhaps sports or online activities, games. What about social action? Those kind of, is that of interest? Does that seem to, or is that seen more as, I don't know, not of interest?
Yes, I mean, if people are convinced that their actions help others, and they get feedback that they are actually helping others, they're much more committed to that action and much more likely to succeed. This isn't true just of youth groups, and this is true of business, this is true of anything. So yes, social action is, and I mean, we're group animals. Human beings are the most social of all, well, I mean, you're religious, the most social of all creatures. They're willing to, and able and wanting to sacrifice their self-interests for a greater good that gives them personal significance.
Great. We have another question over here.
Just one more question. Hastalal from Melbourne. We've been working with young people who have fallen into some of these more extreme groups, but some have realised that they want an exit. But they find it very difficult to exit because they've actually lost their family connections. So they are reluctant to go back there because of fear of repercussions, and they want to be able to get out of that group as well, but find it very difficult. Have you experienced anything like that? Do you have any advice around that sort of situation?
Yeah, that's a pretty hard thing. I mean, unless they've already hunkered down completely and are into the stage of trying to actually commit violence, it's usually possible to help draw people out once you can identify them. And the way to do that is, again, through families and alternate friend networks. Get friends to talk to them, families to talk to them. The best de-radicalization programs I've come across are when you get the families, the communities, the neighborhoods involved. And they basically, I mean, even the best police-run de-radicalization programs. So I've worked a lot, with the Turkish police and with the Saudi government, and even with the American government, except for the PKK, that is the Kurdish militants or Marxist-Leninists in Turkey. The way it happens is someone goes to Afghanistan or Pakistan, assuming they do go. They come back and they've been trapped. And rather than arrest them or beat them up or torture them, the police go to the families and say, look, we don't want a problem, you don't want a problem. What can we do? I mean, what can we do to help things out? And they'll give gifts on Ramadan, they'll help the sister find a job, and they're remarkably successful in actually drawing out the families and the neighborhoods in this way. The Saudis do a similar thing. The way the Saudis do it is, they actually identify people who don't go to the mosque, because everybody goes to the mosque in Saudi. And people stop going to the mosque, then the police are on them right away. And then the Saudis are very rich, right? So if the young people aren't committing an act against the Saudi state, in which the Saudis are pretty much ruthless, if they say they want to go to Yemen, or they want to go to Iraq, or they want to go to Afghanistan, or they want to go to Syria, well, actually, some of them, they're pushing them to Syria, then what the Saudis will do is, they'll intercept them and basically say to them, look, you've got to go through our rehabilitation program, and it's a very expensive rehabilitation program, so it's really not feasible for many countries, where they bring in scholars, they bring in imams, they bring in professors, they bring in artists, and they work with these young people. They teach them to paint, they teach them to act, they discuss the Quran with them, they discuss political philosophy with them, and they talk to their families, and they actually form a formal contract with their families saying, okay, once they're out of this rehabilitation program, which again is pretty nice actually, we give them over to you, and you guarantee that you're gonna keep up with them, and you're gonna tell us if things go wrong. And that seems to be pretty successful, but again, extremely expensive. In Iraq, after the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, they put a general who's part American Indian, Doug Stone, in charge of Abu Ghraib as Petraeus' assistant. And Doug had the idea, look, I want to get people out of this prison, and I don't want anybody to come back into this prison. So he came up with a program working with the communities, very similar to what the Saudis and the Turks are doing. Basically, he goes to the families, and he does the same thing. He brings, everybody and their brother into the prison, and talks through these people, and he had an amazing success rate. That is, almost everybody who was in Abu Ghraib went out and never went back to prison again, was never rounded up again, and many of the people who were in prison actually came back to the prison voluntarily to talk with the other inmates about what they could do to avoid prison and confrontation. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, tried to get, I was at the Senate testifying with Doug, and Lindsey Graham at the Senate tried to get Doug Stone to go to Afghanistan and try this in Afghanistan, but he said, I have to get back to my own life now, because in Afghanistan, it's as crazy as it was in Iraq at the beginning. People try to impose ideas concocted up by the government in the United States, or they propose local cooperative associations or whatever. It's like someone coming up with a Pashtun jirga, coming to Washington D.C. and saying, "Look, everybody here in Washington should love this jirga." I mean, if you give people enough incentives, they'll come to a meeting. But otherwise, it's sort of nuts. So it has to be, as you said, bottom up, through the families, through the friends. About 20% of people get into the jihad through their families, but about 60 to 70% get involved in jihad through their friends, and only the remaining 10% or so get involved through discipleship or through mentoring or through any kind of recruiting. So it's mostly family and friend, and especially friends. Friendship, especially after a young person leaves their family, right? He's at the age of 15, 16, 17, where the family is being left behind as the principal reference group. They're searching for comrades and friends, and these are going to be the strong social bonds in their lives now. And so they're extremely influenced by friends and peer networks. And as you said, it's very hard to break out of them once you're in them. I mean, psychologists do studies, and they show that the political philosophy of a person is set in those first years after leaving the family and going into their first peer groups. That first peer group usually determines the turn in political philosophy for the rest of their life of people. So that's the age where you've got to really speak to them and get involved with them and follow things through. You can't just say, well, you know, pie in the sky programs about how things could get better, or you should be moderate, or these things would be nice if they happen. They need actual action, actual things that drive them, that excite them, that they can become involved with their friends and bring along other friends.
Yep.
And that's the way to de-radicalize as well.
Yep. There was another question.
My question is, what is the role of the world superpowers, in particular the US, in provoking some of these extreme thoughts that may arise in some of the youth, or so-called the marginal groups? In today's era, we can refer to the US foreign policy, for example, as its contemporary methods of imposing Western values onto nations, despite the fact that it may defy the religious and social values of that nation. And it seems that the onus is being removed from the Western superpowers somehow, and justified by blaming some of these socially dismembered or dispositioned individuals. I mean, let's take the Iraqi war, for example. Would you find it extraordinary or something that is extremely shocking, for these sort of ideas to somehow, become embedded or instilled in some of the minds of of an Iraqi person, for example, who's, who's, for example, may have lost some immediate family members, due to some of the US airstrikes and its allies, or may have even been personally persecuted in some of the prisons, such as Abu Ghraib and others. In addition to that, being left with a toppled nation in complete social and political turmoil. And I mean, we're not justifying the actions of these individuals, but what I'm trying to get to here is how far does the United States, and for example, as a superpower, how is the onus being looked at here? I mean, is it completely transferred towards the social situation of these people, or is there also a responsibility, or does they have to show some sort of also accountability towards these some of the actions of these people? So, and are there any any measures being taken towards this in regards to considering the future of another nation, considering some of the repercussions that may happen due to some of the foreign policy decisions that are made? So this is basically the question. Thank you.
Yeah. There are both broad and narrow answers to that very complex question. The United States is the inheritor, as a great power, of salvational ideologies. Now, salvational ideologies really grew up with the universal religions, including Christianity and Islam, which created the concept of humanity. I mean, I work also with small-scale tribes in crazy places like New Guinea or the Amazon, and these small-scale tribes really don't have a notion of our species as a species or all of humanity. Their groups and their names, like Bantu or Navajo, really mean human being. So the universal religions created this global concept of humanity, and they created two concepts new in human history. One was choice, free choice. Doesn't matter what religion you were born in, you could elect to be part of this universal community. And the other one is humanity itself. Now, after the French Revolution, this idea was secularized and came down to earth, and in a way that provoked revolutions, the isms, all the isms that drive modern political systems, from colonialism to anarchism, fascism, communism, socialism, democratic liberalism, jihadism. They're all salvational ideologies. They all believe that they are right and true for everyone in every time. Now, some are more benign than others. Certainly the fascist, or at least the Nazi one, which literally wished to enslave people or exterminate those who didn't agree, was less benign than, for example, democratic liberalism, which believes that notions like free elections and minority rights and things like that should be universally available, as well as free and open economic commerce. This, of course, allows certain things like the accumulation of capital and corporate interests. This has to be controlled. The United States has had a long and tenuous struggle in being able to balance its quest for rights with its deep parochial interests. And its immigration has allowed it to advance. I mean, it's the strongest force the United States have, that it's open to immigration. It's not founded on the idea, like other nations, especially European nations, on a racial essence or a blood essence or a particular history. It's founded on the idea of an idea, however imperfect and however unachieved those ideas are. Now, as a result of World War II, the United States had massive military might and control over vast segments of the world. And in their struggle with the Soviet Union, they increased this military might and this attempt to be able to manage the rest of the world. Most of the world's energy, most of the world's resources were funneled into the United States and used by the United States. 1979, I think, was a crucial turning point in human history. It is when the long dominant hegemony of the West began to decline. With the Iranian Revolution, the failure of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Arab awakening, the rise of Asia and China, all of this has put the dominance of the West, which the United States became the vanguard, in doubt. And the United States has had to recalibrate in this new world. And they've done so fitfully and imperfectly. I know the leaders of the United States. I know the people of the United States. And my feeling is they're not conspirators. I mean, people have the impression that politicians are often conspiratorial. They're just like most normal people. They get up in the morning, they read the newspaper, they say the world is going to hell, what the hell are we supposed to do? And they figure out with their friends and cronies what they should do about it in their own self-interest and the interests of people they care about. Now, the very availability of the massive military might of the United States has made that much too easy and regular an option. And they use that unwisely in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Iraq became a black hole for jihad. There was no reason to invade Iraq and to cause the massive upheavals in Iraq, and the terrible sanctions that were imposed first on Iraq, the subsequent invasion of Iraq, created the conditions so that even the physical destruction of the Al-Qaeda core could lead to a resurrection of the Al-Qaeda movement. In Afghanistan, a similar thing occurred. I mean, the Taliban, no matter how crazy you think the Taliban are, they emerged from the very peculiar conditions of chaos and civil war in Afghanistan following the withdrawal of the Russians. And in that civil war, the United States initially and Pakistan, of course, supported the Taliban. The Taliban, Bin Laden had come to Afghanistan from the Sudan without the Taliban's awareness and without the Taliban's invitation. When the Taliban came to Jalalabad, Bin Laden was already there, and Bin Laden said he offered fealty and assistance to the Taliban in winning the civil war in exchange for being a guest. Okay, there was always a very uneasy relationship between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In fact, no Afghan I know of with ever joined Al-Qaeda before the American invasion of Afghanistan, because the people associated with Al-Qaeda, the Afghans who had actually fought the war, resented that others from the outside were telling them how to pray and how to fight. None of them joined Al-Qaeda. Mullah Omar, there was an interview with Mullah Omar by a friend of mine, Prof Scott, the UPI editor, and Mullah Omar basically says, look, bin Laden is a big mouth. I've taken away his cell phone. I've brought him from Jalalabad to Kandahar. Sometimes we put him on a house arrest. He's promised not to give these interviews anymore. He's promised to stop these kinds of attacks. I'm going to try to see he does that, but I can't control him. And if he does something, I'll convoke the rest of the group in a jirga, and we'll decide whether he should be hosted or whether he should no longer be a guest. By the way, Mullah Omar was asked, so what about women, the position of women? He had a very interesting answer. He said, look, how long did it take suffrage in your country? About 200 years. He goes, and by the way, why don't you bother the Saudis? Why do you keep bothering us? Why don't you leave us alone? After 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan. In October of 2011, just before the invasion, the Taliban sent a letter to the ambassador of Pakistan inviting him to a jirga where, or whatever it was, I think it was a jirga, where they would, in a sense, try bin Laden. And he was invited to present evidence. Of course, the Bush administration laughed at this and said, you know, that's not just given to us or we're going to bomb you into the Stone Age. And the United States invasion actually created an alliance between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda that really never existed. And then the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, are forced over into the border with bin Laden, into the Pakistani border. And the Pakistani tribes, which had nothing to do with any of this, are suddenly infused with their Pashtun brethren who are seeking refuge from American bombers. And so the Americans start bombing the Pashtun tribes on the frontier, Pakistani frontier, and their reaction is exactly the reaction they had to the British invasion 3 times. That is, they were furious. And they were furious at the Pakistani state for allowing this. And so they began attacking the Pakistani state, and in fact, threatening to attack the United States, which the Taliban had never done themselves. And because Pakistan is a nuclear power, and because all the nuclear facilities of Pakistan are located as far from the Indian frontier as possible, namely as close to the northwest frontier as possible, they began attacking nuclear facilities, and everybody starts freaking out. But this terrible situation was created by the invasion of Afghanistan by the United States. Now, one could say that given the enormity of the attack against the United States may have been justified in an initial action against Al-Qaeda and maybe even the Taliban for harboring Al-Qaeda. But once that was done, they should have gotten out immediately. Instead, they invade Iraq, which had nothing to do with anything at all, and then start reintroducing troops in Afghanistan. In fact, the Taliban, which were not supported so much by the Afghan people, were joined by people who had opposed the Taliban, like Haqqani, Jalaluddin Haqqani, who, by the way, our own Congressman Charlie Wilson and our National Security Advisor under Jimmy Carter had called goodness personified when he was fighting the Soviets, all of a sudden becomes enemy number 1 because he's joining forces with the Taliban. Now, why is he joining forces with the Taliban? Basically because the Afghans, for the last 2,000 years, have not liked foreign occupiers, period. It doesn't care whether it's Alexander the Great, or Genghis Khan, or the British, or the Russians, or the Americans. And I think the Americans not only do not learn the lessons of history, I think they're not interested in history. people don't understand that our political system, let me just give you a little indication about how our political system works. Foreign policy is determined exclusively by the National Security Council. The U.S. Congress only interferes when things go bad. And the Defense and State Departments are merely executors of the National Security Council, which consists of the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, the Council of Economic Advisors. That's it. There's no social anything in this. So American foreign policy, unlike American internal domestic social policy, which is extremely open, receptive to immigration, to diversity, to ideas, is extremely narrow and concerned nothing at all with health, education, labor, social issues with respect to the rest of the world, looks only on security issues, military security issues, and economic security issues. And under this determination of foreign policy, there really is no space for dealing with the real human problems of nations and communities and even jihadis. So what is the United States' contribution? This was a long answer to say it's very complex. It's not a very simple thing like a conspiracy that we want to dominate the world. It just isn't the case. They actually believe, you know, encouraging the kinds of values, ideas, and economies will open up the world and everybody will voluntarily join. Many people in Islam believe the same thing about Islam. On a regular playing field.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to perhaps just invite one more question.
Thank you very much, Professor. Your presentation is very giving a lot of inspiration. Actually, in your dialogue here, you have answered the question that I was looking for. But just for the interest of my colleagues and things, we have this kind of issue which you have raised, and we are seeing that these shifts of our youth, how they are going, and their centers coming up. Now the point is, from my perspective, that of course we have to find an answer from Islam, from the Quran and Hadith, and from our experience to rechannelize, remobilize the efforts of our youth. But I thought that I would ask you a question, because you have been deeply studying this. What, from your experience, what skills, psychological skills, that you would have for us as imams to use a tool in negotiating, in talking to our youth or to those organizations, and maybe bring back unity into our town, and try to see that we are not falling into radicalization and extremism.
All right.
Perhaps just a brief answer to that, or maybe 5 minutes or so, and then we'll allow the second question. It's quite a specific question, so can we do that?
Yeah. Well, let me respond sort of as a psychologist. As a psychologist, there are no fixed propositions in religion. The very nature of religious propositions are open-textured and constantly open to interpretation, which makes them adaptive. And the ways you deal with this is the same way nations with seemingly intractable values and conflicts may be able to deal with them without giving them up. That is, giving them interpretations which fit both their aspirations and the needs of the society that you see. So, for example, I'm looking at the debates in Egypt over the very meaning of Sharia. And I see that the Muslim brothers, at least certain factions of the Muslim brothers, interpret it in a wide open way. They say, look, Sharia is God's law, but the way it is applied and to whom it applies depends on the circumstances, depends on the time, and depends on the needs of the people. On the other hand, I see others who say, no, Sharia means this, and this is exactly as it was written at the time of the Prophet. Now, how do you deal with people who say it must mean this, this, and this? I think that on the whole, if you can draw them out again, you will be able to convince them that there's more opportunity, there's more flexibility. And there's more to be gotten personally, and sometimes even professionally or economically, through a more open interpretation. And that interpretation can be negotiated depending upon the particular community and the particular group of youth. There isn't going to be a one fixed set of propositions or interpretations that can be applied uniformly across all these groups.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have, okay, one more question here from...
My question is regarding the young leaving the mosques and not having any interest in that. I think one reason might be that the imams, they don't give Friday sermons, for example, that deal with the social agendas and the suffering of the Muslims all over the world, the persecution you have just mentioned. The imams try to disconnect from that. That's one reason I think that young are not coming to mosques anymore. Now my question is, do you think if the imams, for example, take lead in taking part, for example, in rallies, because we have rallies from time to time for Palestinian issue, for Iraq situation, and so on, international events. And to my knowledge, imams are not happy to go there and be seen in those rallies. Do you think that in doing so, the imams taking part in those events and from time to time talk on their pulpit things that concern politics, do you think that could de-radicalize the youth and show that the imams are not the way they think? Thank you.
No, I don't. I don't think that participation in political activism, especially in the Western democracies, will help the case. I think it will only draw a greater divide between the majority population and Muslim population represented by the mosques. What I do think is that after the Friday sermon, in the discussions, for example, they should be as freewheeling, as open, and as adversarial as possible. That is, in the sense that not to support any particular position, but to allow as much debate and controversy and openness as possible. Because I think it's only then that people can finally decide for themselves, can weigh the costs, the benefits, the rewards and risks of ideas and actions. And I think in the end, a violent jihad and seeking of martyrdom through violent actions leads only to the grave. I think people will see that in the end, and that the opportunities for life are greater, channeled in different directions. And I think this open debate can help that along. Now, I don't think any subject should be taboo, none whatsoever. In fact, I think if you try to censor or taboo subjects, you'll only push people, especially young people, to go in the direction exactly of the subjects that are tabooed or censored. So let it be freewheeling, let it be open, let all opinions be let 1,000 flowers bloom, or weeds, but don't get directly involved in political activism. I think that would be a mistake for your community.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes left. We have one more brief question, or if there is one. I think, okay, all right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Atran. Scott, you've given us a lot of very thought-provoking and useful, I think, insights and advice. And given us a lot to think about here as we start this two-day workshop. So this is you're the first up today. And thank you again as well for being so generous. Obviously you've got a lot to think about and a lot of people requesting a time at the moment, especially with what's happened in Boston. So we appreciate you taking the time out to spend with us this morning or this evening. Can I just ask everyone to join me in thanking Professor Atran? Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening.